The first slice went down sweet, and then the room started to tilt like a ship taking on water. Someone at this boarding house didn't just want you dead, they wanted you to smile while it happened. By the end, you'll understand how Sarah Gale's boarding house became a controlled killing ground, how cyanide was hidden in plain sight, and why the early accident story collapsed under its own details. Because this wasn't one bad pie or one unlucky guest, every delayed suspicion meant more people kept eating, trusting, and dying in the same small rooms. Who had the access, the nerve, and the reason to lace those pies with cyanide? And why did the pattern only become obvious after it was too late? The first scream doesn't sound like fear, it sounds like surprise. A fork clatters onto a plate, a chair scrapes backward, then another. In the boarding house dining room, someone coughs hard, like they swallowed the wrong way. Someone else stands up too fast, as if fresh air might fix it. But it doesn't. A young man bends at the waist, gagging. His face goes pale, then waxen. His eyes water. His hands go to his throat. Across the table, a woman presses a napkin to her mouth and whispers, "It tastes bitter, bitter, like almonds." Within minutes, the room is no longer a room. It is a triage line. People are half standing, half falling. The air feels wrong. Like the body knows something before the mind does. A boarder reaches for the water pitcher. The pitcher tips. Water runs along the table and drips to the floor, and in the center of it all, still on their plates, are the pies. Who brought dessert to this table? And why are people collapsing after the first bite? This is a story about a boarding house that looked ordinary from the street. 2 stories. Narrow porch. Paint that needed work. A place where people came to save money and start over. A place that smelled, most days, like boiled coffee and laundry soap. On the morning it happened, there was nothing in the air that warned anyone. The residents moved through their routines. Boots by the door, coats on hooks. The quiet bargaining of shared space. Then came lunch, a meal that seemed simple, familiar, and after that, dessert. Pies, set out like a gesture of care. Not everyone took a slice. Not everyone had time. But the ones who did began to feel it almost immediately. A heat in the stomach. A dizziness behind the eyes, breath that suddenly wouldn't go deep. Someone tried to laugh it off, and the laugh broke into a wet cough. Someone else said the room was spinning. Then one of them fell. The boarding house keeper, Sarah Gale, heard the commotion and came in. She took in the scene in one glance. Plates, forks, the pie. She called for help. But in those early moments, before the word poison settled into anyone's mind, there was only panic and confusion. And the question was immediate. Was this an accident in the kitchen? Or something done on purpose? The first person to reach the boarding house was not a doctor. It was a neighbor, then another. Then someone ran for the police. By the time an officer arrived, the dining room had changed again. Bodies were shifted onto couches, windows were thrown open, someone fanned a victim with a folded newspaper. The officer looked at the plates. He looked at the half-eaten slices. He listened to the complaints. A burning throat. A pounding head. A taste that wouldn't go away. He did not know what it meant yet, but he knew it was not food poisoning in the casual sense. Not spoiled milk. Not bad meat. This was fast. This was violent. It had a pattern. The victims were the ones who ate the pie. In the chaos, somebody said the word that turns a bad day into a crime: cyanide. It landed like a stone. Because cyanide does not belong in a kitchen. It belongs in a lab, in a factory, in a bottle with warnings. The officer ordered the food gathered and set aside. He asked the simplest question: who made the pies? All eyes shifted towards Sarah Gale, and in that moment, with people still gasping for breath, suspicion found its first home. If Sarah didn't do it, then who did? And how did cyanide get onto her table, if the pies were poisoned? Why did the first people who got sick look like they were just drunk or exhausted? And who benefited from everyone calling it nothing serious for one more day? Boarding houses run on trust. You live with strangers. You learn their footsteps. You accept their habits. You share heat, water, and thin walls. Sarah Gale's house was one of those places. She wasn't rich. She wasn't trying to be. She made her money by keeping rooms filled, sheets clean, meals regular. To the boarders, she was the gatekeeper of normal life. The one who decided if there would be stew on Tuesday, and if the hallway lamp would be lit. But the same system that makes a boarding house work also makes it fragile. One small conflict becomes everyone's business. A missing coin becomes a rumor. A late payment becomes resentment. And when something terrible happens, the building itself seems to turn into a witness. That day, as victims were carried out and the sick were tended, the house began to fill with strangers. Police. A doctor. Neighbors who came to stare, and in the center of every conversation was the same name: Sarah Gale. Because in a boarding house, the food comes from one place, and the person who controls that place becomes the first suspect. But suspicion is not proof, and proof, in a case like this, had to start with what was on the plate. Was the poison in the filling, in the crust, or somewhere else entirely? Cyanide doesn't wander into a kitchen by accident. Somebody brought it in. So who in that house had a reason to keep a supply and a way to explain it if found? Pause on the pie for a second, because the first real clue didn't come from food at all. It came from what the victims' bodies did in the minutes after the first bite. A doctor examined the victims and spoke in careful terms. He asked what they ate. He asked how quickly symptoms began. He asked if anyone smelled anything unusual. Cyanide, if present, could act with terrifying speed. It could steal breath from a person while they were still standing. But the human body is not a simple machine. Different amounts, different tolerances, different fates. Some victims were coherent enough to answer questions. Some were not. As the doctor worked, police began to treat the dining room like a scene. Not a mess, a scene. They lifted plates as if they were evidence. They covered the remaining pie. They asked Sarah Gale to step aside. It is a small humiliation, being told to move away from your own table. Sarah's voice, by accounts, stayed steady. She insisted she served what she always served. She insisted she had no reason to harm the boarders. Then came the question every investigator asks, sooner or later: who had access to the kitchen? In a boarding house, the answer is rarely simple. Sarah had the keys. But a kitchen isn't a safe. People come in for water, for a spoon, for warmth, and if someone wanted to add something to food, they would not need long. They would need only a moment. So if Sarah didn't poison the pies, who had the moment they needed? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. The timeline is the trap. One pie, one pan, one moment when the kitchen was unobserved. Who was alone long enough to do it without being seen, and who was supposed to be watching? Neighbors began to talk. They always do. They remembered small disagreements and inflated them into motives. They recalled Sarah's temper on a bad day, her sharp words over late rent. They repeated old stories, stories that sounded, suddenly, like warnings. But gossip is a cheap tool. It points everywhere. Police needed something that pointed somewhere. They asked about recent tensions. Was anyone being evicted? Had anyone been threatened? Was there a boarder who seemed angry? A boarder who drank too much? A boarder who had been fired? In shared living, anger often simmers quietly. It hides behind closed doors, and on the day of the poisoning, there had been plenty of doors, plenty of chances. Meanwhile, the victims' conditions became the story. Some recovered after hours of care. Some lingered, and at least one, depending on accounts, did not survive. A poisoning can turn into a homicide in a single breath, and the moment there is a death, there is no longer any room for explanations that feel convenient. If cyanide was involved, investigators would have to find where it came from. So where in this town could someone even get cyanide? Cyanide is not like a kitchen spice. It has an industrial life. It appears in places where metals are clean, where chemicals are stored, where pests are killed. To track it, police had to widen their circle. They looked toward businesses, they looked toward workshops, they looked toward pharmacies and supply houses. They asked clerks what had been sold recently. They asked who asked for what, and they learned something important. In many towns, dangerous chemicals could be bought with less scrutiny than you would expect. Sometimes with a name, sometimes with a story, sometimes with a no questions at all. The investigation began to feel like a map of ordinary life. A person buys nails, another buys soap, another buys something that can stop a heart, and all of it looks the same in a ledger. But one detail can change everything. A remembered face, a remembered voice, a customer who seemed nervous, a customer who paid in a hurry, a customer who asked too casually what would happen if someone tasted it. Police needed that detail, and they needed it before fear turned into a mob. Because by now, the town had a story. A woman's pies, a boarding house table, and the taste of almonds. But was that story true? Or was the real buyer of poison still walking for free? The victims weren't random boarders in the wrong place. They were connected by a quiet detail no one wanted to say out loud. What did they all know about Sarah Gale that made them dangerous? Now forget murder for a moment. If this was a mistake, it only works if someone can explain why cyanide was even inside that house. Back at the house, investigators tried to rebuild the day. When did Sarah begin baking? Who saw her in the kitchen? Who came in and out? Who handled the ingredients? Who served the plates? In a careful reconstruction, small things matter. A missing spoon, a jar moved from one shelf to another. A boarder who said they stepped out for a minute. A boarder who said they were never near the pie. And then, always, the same question. Why would someone poison multiple people at once? Most murders are narrow, one target. This was wide, this was reckless, unless it wasn't meant for everyone, unless it was meant for one person, and others were simply in the way. That idea settled into the investigation like a dark possibility, because if the pie was intended for a single plate, then the poisoner might not have wanted a spectacle. They might have wanted a quiet death. A death that looked like illness. A death that looked like illness. And if that is true, then the most important question becomes personal. Who, at Sarah Gale's table, was the real target. The first doctor wrote it off, and that decision echoed through the house like a permission slip. What symptom did they miss that would have pointed straight to cyanide? Attention returned to Sarah, not only because she baked, because she was the center of the house. Any motive that existed inside that building, in any room, eventually touched her. Police asked about her relationships. Who did she trust? Who did she argue with? Who owed her money? Who did she fear? Sarah's answers, by later retellings, were plain. She had boarders who came and went. She had the usual difficulties. Nothing that rose to the level of mass poisoning, but investigators don't just listen, they looked. They watched her when questions turned sharp. They watched her when names were mentioned. They watched her when the victim's conditions were described. Because guilt and innocence often look similar at first: shock, anger, grief. A person can be falsely accused and still tremble. A person can be guilty and still weep. So police tried a different angle. They asked for the recipe. They asked where each ingredient came from. They asked where she stored sugar, flour, and spices. And then they asked about anything unusual. Any powder that didn't belong. Any bottle without a label. Any container moved out of place. If there was a foreign substance in the kitchen, was it hidden there by Sarah or planted there by someone else? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. In poison cases, the smallest physical clue can carry the whole story. A residue. A stain. A smell. A container washed too clean. Investigators searched the kitchen with new eyes. They opened cupboards. They looked beneath the sink. They inspected jars and tins. They checked the trash. And they were not just looking for cyanide. They were looking for the path. How the poison traveled from outside the house to inside the pie. Because cyanide doesn't appear by accident. Not in a pastry, not in a crust. If it was there, someone introduced it. And if someone introduced it, they likely touched something. A spoon. A bowl. A bottle. Even careful people leave traces. The question was whether the traces still existed, or whether the poisoner had the composure to clean up while other people were choking at the table. If the kitchen revealed nothing, would the investigation stall, or would it push police toward a different kind of evidence? Here's the part that changes everything. Not everyone who ate the pie got sick. So was the poison unevenly mixed, or was one plate meant for one person? Here's the reset. The most suspicious person might not be the one who poisoned the pies, but the one who steered everyone away from the truth first. While police searched, the town created its own courtroom. At the market, at the church steps, on front porches. People began to describe Sarah Gale as if they had always known what she was capable of. That is what fear does. It reaches backward and rewrites the past. A strict landlady becomes a villain. A quiet woman becomes suspicious. And the boarding house, once just a building, becomes a symbol. Some people said the boarders were careless. They would eat anything. Some blamed the victims. They should have noticed the taste. Some blamed Sarah for serving food at all. But blame is not an answer. It is a pressure. And pressure can bend an investigation. Police felt it. They knew they had to move fast, so they began pulling at another thread. If the poison was cyanide, then a chemical test could confirm it. Not speculation, not rumor, a result. And if the result came back positive, the next question would be unavoidable. Whose hands in this town were steady enough to use it? The victims' stories began to separate. Not everyone ate the same amount. Not everyone reacted the same way. One person took 2 bites. Another finished the slice. Someone else only tasted the filling and pushed the plate away. Those differences became data. They helped investigators estimate how much poison might have been used. A light contamination could sicken. A heavier dose could kill. And that difference matters, because an inexperienced poisoner might add too little, or far too much. A skilled poisoner might measure. They might have done it before. That thought opened a new possibility. Maybe this wasn't someone acting on impulse. Maybe it was someone with familiarity. Someone who knew what cyanide could do. Someone who knew how to hide it in a sweet thing. If so, then the case wasn't just about access. It was about knowledge. So which person around that boarding house had the kind of knowledge that makes cyanide a weapon? If Sarah Gale was the killer, why keep serving food that would bring police to her door? Unless the point wasn't secrecy, unless the point was control over who lived to tell the story. In the days after the poisoning, the boarding house did not feel like home to anyone. Every sound was suspect. Every door creak sounded like someone sneaking. The kitchen, once a shared comfort, became a threat. People who hadn't been sick began to imagine symptoms. A stomachache became a warning. A headache became panic. Because poison creates a special kind of terror. It breaks the oldest idea we have. That food is safe. That eating is life. In response, police kept asking the same core questions, just in different ways. Who benefited? Who hated? Who had reason? They looked at financial pressures. They looked at romance and jealousy. They looked at grudges, and they looked at the boring motives too. The kind that come from feeling overlooked. The kind that come from humiliation. The kind that come from one person thinking, in a hot moment, that they can make another person pay. But still, the case hinged on a practical fact. Somebody had to obtain cyanide. Somebody had to transport it. Somebody had to introduce it into the food without being seen. So where is the weak point in that chain? The moment where the poisoner makes a mistake. Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. A boarding house runs on routines, meal times, dishes, leftovers, pantries. Which routine was quietly altered right before the deaths, and who noticed it too late? Stop picturing a shadowy killer. Picture a normal kitchen in daylight, with one quiet action that no one thinks to mention until it's fatal. If Sarah Gale was innocent, the simplest explanation was also the most frightening. Someone walked into her kitchen. Someone used her tools. Someone used her reputation. And someone walked away. The boarding house itself made that possible. There were boarders, yes, but there were also visitors. Friends who stopped by. Delivery people. Repairmen. Neighbors who borrowed sugar. When a home is also a business, the line between private and public is thin. Investigators tried to identify every outsider who had been near the house. They asked who came to the door that week. They asked if anyone seemed interested in the kitchen. They asked if anyone lingered. But memory is unreliable. People remember what matters and forget what doesn't. And before the poisoning, no one thought to remember the man at the back step, or the woman in the hallway, or the stranger who asked for a glass of water. Now, everyone tried to remember, and that effort, that desperate reaching, is where false leads are born. In all that noise, how could police separate a real witness from a story someone wanted to believe? Behind closed doors, Sarah Gale was also being watched by the system. In cases like this, suspicion can become confinement without bars. Her movements noted, her words repeated, her history examined. And in those examinations, investigators often find two things: the life a person lived, and the life people imagined they lived. Sarah had her own past. Every adult does. Old addresses, old relationships, old disagreements. Police looked for anything that resembled a pattern. Had there been earlier incidents, earlier illnesses, earlier accusations? Because poisoners rarely start big. If someone had experimented before, there might have been a smaller event that was dismissed, a boarder who got sick and moved out, a pet that died unexpectedly, a neighbor who complained of a strange taste. It is easy to invent these stories after the fact, hard to prove them. But the urge to find a pattern is strong because a pattern feels like safety. It suggests the danger has a shape. So did Sarah's past contain a shape? Or was it being forced into one? Someone tried to clean up after the sickness started, but clean up can also be erasure. What vanished from the kitchen before investigators ever saw it? At some point, every investigation has to narrow, not to one theory, to one person, or at least one direction. The boarding house offered a limited cast: Sarah, the boarders, and the near circle of neighbors and visitors. Police began to focus on contradictions. Who said they were in one place but were seen in another? Who claimed they never touched the food but knew details they shouldn't? Who seemed too eager to explain? Those are the classic tells, but classic tells can belong to innocent people too. A nervous person can sound guilty. A guilty person can sound calm. So police went back to the material world, the poison itself. If cyanide was used, it had to be introduced somehow. Sprinkled, dissolved, mixed. And depending on how it was applied, it might leave a clue, an uneven distribution. A concentrated spot, a slice that was far more dangerous than another. If investigators could learn where the cyanide was strongest, they could learn where it was added. So was the poison baked into the pie, or put on after it left the oven. The cyanide had to come from somewhere local, somewhere mundane, somewhere no one would question. So what business, medicine, or household product could Sarah Gale point to as an innocent source? Let's flick the room. What if the target wasn't the person who died first, but the person who survived long enough to talk? Consider what it means if the poison was baked in. It means the poisoner had time. It means they had access during preparation. It means they could have mixed the substance into the filling or dough. That points towards someone comfortable in the kitchen, someone who wouldn't raise suspicion by being there. Now consider the opposite. If the poison was added after baking, it could have been done quickly. It could have been done while the pie cooled. It could have been done after it was sliced. That opens the suspect, because it could happen in a minute. A dusting, a dab, a small, deadly addition. Investigators would have tried to track the pie's path, where it sat, who could reach it, whether it was covered, whether it was left unattended. The pie, in that sense, became a timeline, and the timeline could reveal a gap, a moment when the kitchen was empty, a moment when someone was alone with the dessert. So what was that moment, and who was there when it happened? As the case grew, so did the stakes. If someone died, the charge could become murder. If multiple people were harmed, it could become attempted murder again and again. And in the court of public opinion, it was already murder. Sarah Gale's name was being spoken with certainty, even as evidence remained unclear. That dynamic can shape a trial before one begins. Witnesses feel pressure to be helpful. Helpful becomes confident. Confident becomes absolute. And absolute is dangerous, because poison trials often rely on inference. Few people watch someone sprinkle cyanide. Few people catch a poisoner mid-act. Instead, cases are built from opportunity and motive, from chemical results, from purchase records, from testimony about bitter taste and sudden collapse. and from the assumption that the person nearest the food must be the person who did it. But assumptions can send an innocent person to prison. So what did investigators have that could not be explained away as coincidence? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. Witnesses disagreed on one small detail: who served the slices. Why would people misremember something that simple unless someone made sure they did? If Sarah was arrested, it would likely have followed a familiar script. Questioning. A statement. A denial. An attempt to poke holes in that denial. Sometimes a confession. But confession is not certainty either. People confess under pressure. People confess to stop an interrogation. People confess when they are exhausted. So a responsible case needs more than words. It needs something solid. A purchase tied to a person. A container found in a room. A witness who saw the poison handle. In the absence of those things, prosecutors lean harder on narrative. They build a story of who Sarah was. They build a story of why she would do it. They build a story of how she could do it without being seen. And then they ask a jury to choose between that story and her denial. But juries are made of people, not machines. People who can be swayed by fear, by disgust, by the image of a pie on a plate. So if a trial happened, what story did the state tell about Sarah Gale, and did it match the evidence? In poison cases, the defense often makes the same argument. Access, opportunity, reasonable doubt. They point to the shared nature of the space. They point to how many hands touched the kitchen. They point to the impossibility of proving who introduced the substance. And they point to an uncomfortable truth. A woman who runs a boarding house is easy to stereotype. She can be painted as greedy, as harsh, as controlling. Those traits make a tidy motive. They also make a lazy one. Because harshness is not homicide. Control is not cyanide. If the defense could show that someone else had a reason to harm a boarder or to harm Sarah herself, it could shift the entire case. Jealousy, revenge, a dispute over money, even a prank that turned lethal. But an alternate suspect must be more than a shadow. A real person, with a real path to poison. So who, besides Sarah, had both motive and the means to carry cyanide into that house? The house wasn't just a crime scene. It was a ledger of favors, debts, and resentments. Which dispute came to a head right before the poisoned pies appeared. One sentence changes the case. The poison didn't just kill, it sent a message. And the message was aimed at someone still living in that house. There is another possibility that haunts cases like this. A mistake. Not the mistake of poisoning the wrong people. The mistake of identification. Cyanide has a reputation. But the world contains other poisons. Other chemicals that burn and choke. Other substances that can mimic that bitter, sharp taste. In an era before modern forensic standards, certainty could arrive too early. A doctor's impression becomes a diagnosis. A diagnosis becomes a headline. A headline becomes a verdict in the public mind. So it matters what was actually confirmed, not what was assumed. If chemical testing was done, how reliable was it? If it was not done, why did everyone agree on cyanide? Because if the poison wasn't cyanide, the entire search for its source could have been misguided. And a misguided search can still convict someone. So what, exactly, was proven about what the victims ingested? Even when the science is solid, poison cases are emotional. Food is intimate. A pie is a gesture. It says, "You are welcome here." It says, "Sit and eat." So when a pie becomes a weapon, it violates something basic. The victims carry that violation. not just in their bodies, in their memory. Some survivors never eat the same way again. They watch plates, they question hosts, they flinch at bitterness, they smell every drink. A boarding house after an event like this can become unlivable, even if the building remains, even if the rooms still rent. Every hallway becomes a reminder. Every meal becomes a test of trust. And if Sarah Gale was innocent, she becomes a victim too. A woman whose livelihood is destroyed by one afternoon. If she was guilty, then the victims never truly ate with her again. They were simply bait. Both possibilities are terrible. So which one was true, and why did the truth prove so hard to hold on to? Quick recap. Here's what we know so far, and the one detail that still doesn't fit. Cases like this often end in one of three ways: a conviction, an acquittal, or a lingering uncertainty that becomes legend. When people say the Sarah Gale cyanide pies, they are repeating a frame, a name attached to an act, a story compressed into a phrase, but phrases hide complexity. They hide the investigative dead ends. They hide the witnesses who changed their minds. They hide the evidence that was lost or mishandled. They hide the legal arguments. And they hide the lives that were reshaped. In a boarding house, people rarely stay long. They move. They disappear into other towns. They become hard to find. That makes justice harder, because justice relies on memory. And memory fades, so if the case did not produce a clear, permanent answer, what part of it turned into the official story and what part was left out? What we know in outline is brutal. A shared meal, a sudden sickness, a suspected poison, a woman at the center of blame. But the outline is not the full picture. The full picture is made of small human moments. The person who took a bite and joked about the taste. The person who didn't eat dessert and lived with survivor's guilt. The neighbor who ran for help. The doctor who tried to name the unseen. The officer who stood over the plates and realized this was not an accident. And Sarah Gale, whether guilty or not, sitting with the knowledge that her name would be attached to poison. In the end, the case forces us to ask what we always ask in stories of hidden violence. What is the difference between suspicion and truth? And how many lives can be altered before that difference is resolved? Because even after the ambulances leave, even after the headlines fade, one question lingers. In that boarding house dining room, who truly put cyanide